Okay, well, welcome everybody to our third installment of the Catchment and Wetland Science Seminar Series. Today we're welcoming Scott Davidson from the University of Waterloo to speak with us about linear disturbances across peatlands in northern Alberta. My name is Rebecca Free, and I am a PhD student with the Catchment and Wetland Science Research Lab at the University of Alberta, supervised by David Olefelt. And I will be chairing the session along with my co-chair, Lauren Thompson. And so just a few reminders for general housekeeping for things like this, standard rules apply for Zoom calls. So remember to always mute thyself, and we will take questions at the end, and we prefer those in the chat box just so that everyone gets a chance to put their questions in, and we'll address those in the order that they come in. And so that's it for the housekeeping. I would just like to introduce Scott. Scott got a MA in geography from the University of Dundee in Scotland, where he did a thesis on vegetation succession on debris-covered glaciers in the Italian Alps. He moved to the University of Sheffield in England to undertake an MSc in polar and alpine change in the Department of Geography, which should have been focused on tundra vegetation communities in Svalbard, but one broken hand later, it switched to the controls on heathland vegetation in Scotland. And plot twist, it's sheep. So he moved over to the Department of Animal and Plant Sciences at Sheffield to do a PhD in sheep, just kidding, where he looked at the spatial heterogeneity of methane emissions across a variety of Arctic tundra landscapes. And as part of this, he did fieldwork across the North Slope in Alaska. Scott has worked in a variety of Arctic landscapes, including Abisko in Sweden, and he started as a postdoctoral fellow in the Wetland Soils and Greenhouse Gas Exchange Lab in 2018, where he now works on all things peat. And so with no further ado, here you go, Scott.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Scott. Can you hear me okay? Hopefully, yes.
Yes.
So yeah, my pronouns are he, him. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation today to speak about part of my postdoc research, looking at the impacts of linear disturbances in peatlands in northern Alberta. I just want to give a quick thank you to the partners that have contributed to this research, especially the Boreal Ecosystem Recovery and Assessment Project. I'd like to say a big shout out to the members of the Wetland Soils and Greenhouse Gas Exchange Lab led by Maria Strack for just essentially being the best. I couldn't ask for a better team to be part of. So Canada is the traditional territory of many Indigenous groups who were managing the landscape for thousands of years before settlers arrived. So I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Atawan, Daran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers either side of the Grand River. And the research that I'll be speaking about today takes place within boundaries of Treaty 8, the traditional lands of the Dene, Cree, and Métis of northern and northeastern Alberta. And I encourage you all to take the time to think and acknowledge about the traditional territories where you live and work as well. So my research interests are mostly focused on the ecology and biogeochemistry of peatlands using a variety of lab, field, and remote sensing techniques. But this work also involves investigating the impact of a range of disturbances, both natural, such as wildfire, or anthropogenic or human-caused disturbances, which is what I'm going to focus on today. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you all how important or how awesome peatlands are. But for those who don't know, they are wetland ecosystems that store large amounts of organic matter in their soil. And we're lucky in Canada to have a huge amount of peatlands, covering at least 12% of the land area. And in fact, around a quarter of all peatlands in the world are found in Canada. And this is storing approximately 150 to 160 billion tons of carbon. And there are a variety of different peatlands in Canada, with three dominant across the boreal: bogs, fens, and swamps. And simply, bogs are peatland ecosystems where the precipitation is their main source of water. They're nutrient poor with low species diversity. Fens, on the other hand, are mainly fed by groundwater, typically having a higher nutrient status and therefore higher species diversity. And finally, swamps. They sometimes feel like the outcasts of wetlands in Canada, but they're a personal favorite of mine. And I suppose I could come back and speak for an hour about swamps, but I probably should move on. But given their importance of these peatland ecosystems in Canada, they're under threat from existing and ongoing land use change following human disturbances. So if we take a look at the map on the left here, we see the distribution of peatlands in Alberta, with the warmest colors showing the highest density of peatlands. And if we take a look at this map on the right of Alberta, we see the areas in brown showing the oil sands distribution. And currently, oil sands mining has disturbed approximately 950 square kilometers of land area. And if we were to overlay these two maps together, you can see the areas of peatlands and the areas of oil sands distributions quite clearly overlap. And this overlap leads to a lot of activities that have a negative impact on the functioning of these ecosystems and their ability to store carbon. So these disturbances include mining, which results in the complete removal of the previous landscape, the creation of well pads or well sites, where large pads of mineral fill are placed in the landscape to allow for in situ oil sands mining infrastructure, as shown in the top right here. And connecting all these disturbances are roads, be it highways, winter roads, access roads, which may or may not be permanent, but they can have a big impact on the landscape. And finally, the most abundant disturbance in the boreal, and the one that I'll focus on today, seismic lines. So what is a seismic line? Well, I will be honest and say that before I moved to Canada, I had no idea what a seismic line was. I'd never heard of them. I did start thinking to myself that the boreal has way more earthquakes than I initially thought. But no, seismic lines are long linear clearings across the boreal. They cut through forests and wetlands for subsurface petroleum exploration. And it's not really important for this talk and how they actually look for those deposits, but it's clear that this method of clearing the trees has created a hell of a lot of disturbance over the years. And in fact, Maria Strack and others published a study last year looking at the impact of these lines on potential methane emissions. And they found there's over 345,000 kilometers of lines crossing peatlands in Alberta alone, disturbing nearly 1,900 square kilometers. Or put more plainly, it's enough to go around the world 9 times. And on the map on the right here, we see the hot colors indicating where high densities of seismic lines and high proportions of peatlands coincide. So I'm sure you'll agree from this map here, it's pretty intense on the landscape. And also these disturbances occur across the whole boreal, not just in Alberta. And the databases that are used to calculate these numbers are probably underestimating the amount of lines that are found here. So this really does highlight the scale of these disturbances. So how are these lines created? Well, in order to, see below ground for oil and gas deposits, it requires the removal of the trees. And in fact, there are 2 different main types of seismic lines. The older style, what is now known as legacy lines or 2D lines. And for the rest of this talk, I will refer to them as wide lines. And these can be 5 to 10 meters wide. And as you can see from the photo on the left-hand side, they essentially look like large runways across the landscape. And they were created around 50, 60, 70 years ago. But it was acknowledged quite quickly that it caused a lot of disturbance on the landscape. So they decided to move to something called low impact lines, also known as 3D lines or narrow lines. And these kind of have minimal ground disturbance. They don't remove or completely flatten that typical peatland microtopography, and they kind of wiggle across the landscape. And if we take a look at some Google Earth imagery, you can see there's a difference in grid density of these lines. The wider lines that I show here in this image, although they're spaced out, they still cause a lot of disturbance, as that photo previously shown. But with the narrow lines, although they have less ground disturbance per se, as you can see from this image here, there's so many more of them, and the landscape is just so much more disturbed, all having big impacts on the ecosystem functioning of the landscape. So you may have noticed that from the photos that I've shown previously and the photos I've shown in this slide here, there's something missing. There are no trees growing back on these lines. And you would think that given how narrow they are with trees on either side, that sapling recruitment might not be too difficult, but they just don't seem to grow back as was first thought. And even if there is some recovery, the species that are coming back may not be typical of what was actually found there originally. And a study by Lee and Button found that after 35 years, around only 8% of seismic lines had recovered to have over 50% woody vegetation. And this number is probably even lower in wetland areas. And there's kind of a general consensus in the literature that the trees don't come back just because it's too wet. But as a lab, we wonder if it's a combination of a variety of factors, including those hydrological conditions, but also shifts in vegetation or microbial communities, competition or availability of nutrients, for example. And I'm going to jump into some more of these in detail as the talk goes on. So a lot of the work on the impacts of seismic lines has focused on the ecological impacts on that kind of charismatic megafauna of the Canadian boreal woodland caribou. So these lines, if you look back to those previous photos, they can essentially act like highways for wolves, and they allow the wolves to penetrate the forest far easier than before, and really impacts that predator-prey dynamic. And wolves are having a much bigger impact on caribou populations following these disturbances. And industry has to do something about this. And they have been tasked with trying to restore these lines, bring back that tree cover, try and help these dwindling caribou populations using a variety of methods. And one such method is mounding or inverted mounding. So the goal here is to bring back that microtopography by digging down into the peat and flipping it over to create an artificial hummock, as shown in the photos. As you can see from the photos here though, these drier areas, even though they're more likely to encourage tree growth, it's a pretty destructive method of restoration on sites that are already feeling the impact of a significant disturbance. So there's a lot of impact here on these landscapes. And the density of these hummocks as well is pretty intense across these lines. So we wanted to get a better understanding of how these disturbances affect ecosystem functioning. So the focus of my talk today will be looking at two studies, one on the impact on the creation of seismic lines and subsequent restoration on soil properties. And then I'll look at the overall impact of these disturbances on the vegetation communities themselves. So first up, I'm going to speak about some soil. We collected soil samples across a wide variety of seismic line types and ecosystems, including both narrow and wide lines at a site near Fort McMurray in Alberta, crossing what we classified as a poor mesic site. This site was actually quite hard to classify. And in reality, a lot of these lines are crossing a lot of different ecosystems in quite a small area. So some of the samples were quite uplandy or quite mineral, and some of them are really quite probably wetland areas. But we also had some unrestored and mounded lines crossing a treed fen near Conklin in Alberta. And we analyzed these samples for bulk density, for moisture, for organic matter content, for the CN ratios, and for some stable isotope work as well. So looking at the results, and given that initial disturbance from the heavy machinery used to create the lines, we wanted to look at the compaction at these sites. So the figure here is just showing bulk density along the top panel and soil moisture in the bottom panel, along a transect from on the middle of the line, the edge of the line, 5 meters into the adjacent forest, and 20 meters into the adjacent forest, which we're classing as a reference at that poor mesic site. And we found that wide lines in particular have a significantly higher bulk density. And this is likely due to how these lines were created using that heavy machinery back in the day, which has significantly compacted the soil compared to the natural areas. And this compaction causes a decrease in soil aeration, leading to changes in soil morphology and impacting the productivity of the system. And these all linked together could be a reason why the trees don't recover or come back as we once thought. And again, related to this compaction, we found the lines are actually much wetter, and with the soil surface now much closer to the water table. And here I have a similar plot as before, with bulk density along the top and soil moisture on the bottom. But at the treed fen site, we have plots on mounded lines, unmounded lines, and reference areas. And we found that method of inverting the soil to create the hummocks, as shown in the photo here, causes more compaction. And that soil from deep within the soil profile is now exposed to the air. And these mounds on the landscape suddenly like collapse or they slump down as that structural integrity of the soil is lost. But once again, the lines are wetter than the adjacent natural areas. And this has big impact on the carbon fluxes, especially in these wetland sites. As not only is the water table now closer to the surface, but if you look at this photo here, the creation of these hummocks can also lead to ponding or open water, which, for example, could have big impacts on the potential methane emissions from these sites. So when looking at the soil organic matter, we have here on the non-peatland or the pure mesic sites for narrow and wide lines, we found a drop of around 30% at the non-peatland sites, from the edge of the line to the middle of the line. And this is quite substantial and could be attributed to the mineralization of organic matter following disturbance. And that's either at the time of the construction of the line itself or persisting in the new conditions, well, or both. But we can also see that if you look at the treed fen sites, we have those mounded lines and those unmounded lines. The whole sample here, the whole soil sample was organic, it's essentially all just moss. So we can't really capture those differences in organic matter to see impacts using this method. And given that we didn't have the opportunity or the time in 2018 to do a whole season of fluxes at this site, we decided to look at some methods to see if we could capture the impact of disturbance on decomposition using some proxies, such as the carbon-nitrogen ratios and the 13C and 15N stable isotopes. So the disturbances can cause changes in the isotopic composition of the soil, including enrichment of 13C and 15N. And 13C in particular can be used to differentiate between the isotopic effects in the early stages of decomposition. So we found at these sites lower carbon-nitrogen ratios, indicating that decomposition is enhanced in these artificial humic areas. And this was further supported by the enriched 13C as shown in the top plot here. And this is a useful indicator of enhanced decomposition post-disturbance and potential carbon loss, given that we cannot capture that loss of organic matter at these wetland sites. And the removal of the vegetation, the woody vegetation here, could also lead to some differences in nitrogen inputs into the lines, between the lines and the undisturbed areas. And we have some studies in the lab going forth at the moment looking at these relationships. So to summarize this section, we found that overall, not only the creation of the lines, but the lines themselves and the restoration have significant effects on the soil. And that inverted mounding technique, although may be beneficial from a tree recovery point of view, it is likely enhancing further carbon loss from the system. But it's not all doom and gloom. Industry are actually really keen to try and improve on these methods of restoration to try and maintain some of those ecosystem functions. In our lab, alongside collaborators in Alberta and industry as well, are looking at ways to improve this restoration method to try and avoid such disturbance while also still bringing back the trees. And one such way is something we've piloted recently is the humic transfer technique, where we take intact humics from the natural area and we place them on the line upright to try and maintain some structure, to try and bring back that tree cover. And importantly, we do it at much less density as well. And we have some master students in our lab, Kim, Megan, and Taylor, who are looking at a variety of processes such as nutrient availability and the greenhouse gas exchange dynamics following restoration to try and help understand these processes. So now that we've got a better grasp on the overall impacts on this disturbances and restoration on the soil, I wanted to see if we could see any impact on the vegetation communities themselves. And there's a lot of work being done recently by our collaborators looking at tree height or tree recruitment or woody vegetation on these lines. But it does seem that the ground layer itself has kind of not been the focus of recent work. So we wanted to see what's going on there. And we have a few study sites near Peace River in Alberta, where Percy Corsa, a PhD student in our lab, is looking at seismic line impacts on greenhouse gas exchange. So I took advantage of this setup and I did a study looking at the vegetation itself. Because I thought it would be really neat to see if we could capture any phenological differences between the plots on the line, so the plots with no tree cover, and the adjacent natural areas, and where in some areas there's actually really quite dense tree cover, and I can't really move through them because I'm so tall. Because I initially hypothesized that the plot on the line was going up faster given the lack of tree cover. So it allows for more solar radiation. And these seismic lines, the plots on the seismic line are warmer than the adjacent natural areas. And overall, we think that the system is maybe more productive. So we did this study a study at two sites, a treed bog and a treed fen, and they're both impacted by seismic lines. And we collected a photograph just using a smartphone every time we took a flux measurement, both on and off the line, alongside a mid-season vegetation survey in 2019. So we wanted to use these photographs to see if we could track how the vegetation communities greened up over the course of the summer. So we used the green chromatic coordinate as shown in the top two plots here. We were slightly delayed in the beginning of the season by some nearby wildfires, meaning we couldn't get out to the field, but we did manage to capture a nice greenness over the course of the growing season. And although there isn't a huge difference in greenness between the sites, what is interesting is there's a difference from time to maximum greenness between positions and between sites. So the fen site did what we expected it to do. It greened up around 6 days earlier than the natural site. But the plots on the bog, they hit their maximum greenness 10 days later than the natural site, which is not what we expected, and it's not kind of where I thought this would be going. So there are some interesting things at play here, and this work is still quite preliminary. But I think one of the main reasons for that change in greenness is probably the shift in vegetation communities following disturbance. So we have some plots here looking at differences between plot sites on the line and off the line. And at the bog site, we see a shift from a feather moss lichen dominated community to a sphagnum dominated community. And this shift is even more apparent at the fen site, which goes from feather moss lichen to being really quite dominated by sedges. And these shifts in the vegetation communities are likely due to the changes in the hydrological conditions that we showed earlier. These lines are wetter, so the communities that are moving in are different. But what's also really interesting is it could also indicate why tree recovery is poor. It could be that the sphagnum or the sedges, they grow too fast and they outcompete any tree saplings that they may have managed to make it onto the line, but they don't get to make it any further. And I have these two videos here just showing, I think it's a really nice visualization of how a peatland changes over the course of the summer. And on the left here, we have a natural undisturbed fen plot site, we're showing it greening up. And on the right, we have the disturbed fen. And as you can see, not only is there a big difference in the community itself, but there's a big difference in the greenness and the timing of greenness. So the sedge site takes a bit longer to get going in the spring, but we see it quite quickly catches up. So I went into this project thinking that we'd find some really cool stuff about the greenness of the sites that'd be really interesting. And we didn't find too much difference in the greenness. But what we did find that was super useful was that the greenness itself was a good indicator of carbon uptake. And here I just have a plot of gross ecosystem photosynthesis as a function of greenness. And we can see there's a good relationship between greenness and carbon uptake, especially at those disturbed sedge-dominated sites on the right-hand side there. And I think the R squared for these are between 0.3 and 0.5 for each location. So not bad at all. But what I find really interesting is that maybe that shift in vegetation community post-disturbance, maybe it's not necessarily a bad thing. So even though there's a shift in species composition, these new communities, they may offer a more similar or even sometimes a better carbon storage function, despite the lack of trees. So the next steps with this work is to try and tease out some of these results and see if we can scale up our findings. So I don't only want to look at the carbon dynamics across a wider area, but I think it'd be really neat to use this as a tool, as a means to understand where we should maybe focus restoration efforts. Is there any point in focusing on a sphagnum line or a sedge-dominated line? And we can maybe use it as a tool for management in the future. We were also going to look at plant physiological differences between species on and off the lines. And we were going to do it this year, but COVID happened. But future work led by Ellie Good, another postdoctoral fellow in the lab, will be looking at plant traits on and off the line in the future. So I'm super interested to see what we find there. So to summarize, we can see quite clearly that there's a significant impact on the landscape of these lines. They still leave a very distinctive disturbance legacy in the landscape, decades after they were first created. And even in some cases, they still look like they're only disturbed a matter of years ago. And that first disturbance of creating the lines has caused an impact on the physical properties of the soil through compaction, but also the chemical properties through changes in decomposition or mineralization, for example. And the current method used by industry to restore these lines, again, has big impacts on how these ecosystems are functioning. And if we think back to those photos I showed of the inverted mounding techniques, That's a lot of disturbance to put back on a landscape where the goal is to promote restoration. But there are moves towards different types of restoration to minimize these losses. So that's a good thing. And it doesn't just impact the soil. There is a distinct shift in vegetation communities following disturbance. And what's interesting is, in some cases, this shift in vegetation may be beneficial from a carbon point of view, but may also be the reason for poor tree recruitment. So all in all, essentially, it's very complicated. Yeah, it's a thinker. So things to think about, and I'd like you all to think about this where you are, is what about the future of these sites? Well, we see that mounding may work in some respects to get the trees back. But is there a trade-off between causing more disturbance and more carbon loss to get there? Maybe we should focus our efforts on only restoring upland lines and just leave the wetland sites as they are. If they're nice wetland sites with nice sphagnum carpets soaking up all that carbon, should we really disturb them? I don't know. And does that lack of tree cover mean that sites are no longer productive? Should we restore them? And I will say, I'll leave it up to you to think what you think. This is a topic that I wrestle with constantly, and I apologize there's not a more clear, definitive answer at the end of this talk, but that's part of the fun, isn't it? We get to figure out these things. And finally, I think we need to improve our mapping of disturbances across the whole of Canada. So we're really lucky in Alberta. They have incredibly good data sets on human disturbances. For example, the ABMI Human Footprint Database is really, really useful. But the same can't be said for other provinces. They don't have similar databases. And even ABMI is probably underestimating a lot of these disturbances across Alberta. So I think we need to get better inventories of disturbance to try and understand these impacts across much larger areas. I'm going to take a few seconds at the end. If you're attending AGU next week, as a lab, we have 2 seismic line presentations. One from myself on Thursday, looking at that phenological greening stuff. And I really encourage you to check out a student that I co-supervise, Megan Schmidt. She's got a talk on Friday, 11th of December, looking at the impact of that new humic transfer technique restoration method on the CO2 and the methane fluxes. And that's on Friday, 11th of December. And finally, I'd like to promote the Peatland DCR action team. We've had a flurry of stuff on Twitter today, and we even had an article come out in EOS about our new network. But for those who don't know, it's a network of peatland early career researchers. And if you're not already, please do follow us on Twitter or check out our website if you'd like to get involved. And we are hosting a holiday party tomorrow at 1 p.m. It's gonna be very relaxed and some fun games we're gonna do. So if you want to join, please let us know. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and I welcome any questions from you all.